Hello, and welcome to Introducing Me. I'm your host, Sarah. I started this podcast to get to know other people and lifestyles while discovering more about myself. Each episode, I will give a new guest a chance to discuss their background, culture, interests, or whatever they want to talk about to help increase all of our own worldviews. Today, I would like to introduce you to Amethysta. She has experience in biochemistry and analytics, but also a passion for psychology and philosophy. In 2022, she transitioned genders and now focuses on researching identity and gender. So I'm grateful to have Amy here today to share more about her life, passions, and everything she's got going on. We've been talking here for a little bit, and I've been happy to get to know her. So thank you so much, Amy. Why don't you go ahead and tell the audience more about yourself?
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for that introduction. I'm going to have to see if I can live up to it. It's and the worst part here is that it's actually probably going to be disappointing because I wanted to give like the one statement, the one sentence introducing me bit here. And I think the way I would sum up is just to say that I am an ordinary, typical, normal human. And I recognize there were probably people out there who would look at me or hear where I came from, hear the life experiences that have challenged me and what ultimately I ended up doing with them, and say, well, that's really decidedly not typical or normal. But I believe, not even I believe, I mean, what humans do, what makes us such fascinating topics of discussion is we look deep inside and we find the strength that is in there and we bring it out and we change our physical environment or our social environment. Some people even change themselves. I know it's crazy. But we overcome adversity. And everything that I've done in my life has just been to look inside, to find the person I am, to find the identity, and to manifest that in reality. And as a result, overcame, some significant adversity. But I find that to be a normal human experience.
Yes, figuring out who you are and, making sure life surrounding you is what you want it to be is very important and good for the soul, as one can say. So I want to start a little bit with, kind of just in general, where you got to or how you got to where you are today. So even with just like your interests in you started in biochemistry and now I believe
Right.
that's not necessarily your focus anymore. So how has all of that transitioned?
I think I will start by saying my whole life is characterized by wanting to ask the question, why? I mean, growing up, when I thought this was a hilarious story and my mother thought it was terrible. But when I was applying to graduate schools, they want you to write like a little, here's who I am. And I remember when I was a kid, I would take apart alarm clocks. Now, so this was the 1970s, ladies and gentlemen and kids. And it used to be alarm clocks. You unscrewed them and, there was a spring in them and it would shoot out. And I thought it was the funniest thing ever. And I left this string of alarm clock casualties that I thought was great. My mother said she had to buy a bunch of clocks. It wasn't very funny. Yeah, I'm sorry, Mom, but, it's what you got to do. I liked it when the spring shot out. It was pretty impressive. So I always wanted to ask why. I have a lot of stories where I could talk about how I asked why, but I wanted to look at genetics at least initially. So I went into biochemistry. I was very interested in biochemistry when I was younger because it was the sort of prevailing attitude, and there is still a lot of this attitude about that genetics really define the person we are, our identity, even even to some extent, people believe it defines our thoughts, it defines our political party, it defines our behavior, it defines so much of ourselves. And so I thought, well, cool, genetics, let me go into that because maybe I can engineer a better human being. This is the hubris you have when you're a kid. So I went into biochemistry. Later on, realized that chemistry aligned with what I wanted to do better because it was more of a why. I went into biology classes and I went, oh, I'm learning how or what really is, I guess, what I learned. I'm learning what, but I want to know why. And so I went into chemistry, ultimately completed a PhD in analytical chemistry. So I did electrochemistry, and then I also this was great. I also worked on display technology, so I tried to make a better television set. It's not exactly the most noble purpose you could do in graduate school, but and those displays, by the way, fell by the wayside very quickly. I made a prediction in, I don't know, probably 1996, I think, that LCD screens would never, get above a certain size, certainly would not be commercially viable. And as I look at you on my two 29-inch, LCD monitors, I feel somewhat sheepish, but there we are. So because I did that in graduate school, because I worked on display technology, I didn't do something that I really, really wanted to do. And so instead, I reinvented myself. And I said, I think I'm going to go be a software engineer because I liked software when I was 12, when the Commodore 64 came out or so. I don't remember exactly when, but because that's how old I am. Memory is the first thing that goes. And so I liked it when I was a kid. I thought I'll try to get into it. I got a job the old-fashioned way in aerospace, which is nepotism. And that launched my software career. So I went from being an engineer up into architecture, which again is sort of this higher level why, it's a why at the system level. And then ultimately went into management, really for two reasons. The first was that you may have noticed I'm different from many other software engineers in that I do talk, right? I mean, I'm talking to you now. I'm laughing. Hopefully, my conversation is not exceptionally boring. And, I notice you were quiet there. Thanks, Sarah. It's a stereotypical software engineer is not, right? So I was willing to talk, and I also wanted to know why. Why do teams work? Why are some software projects delivered on time and in budget, and why are some not? Why are most actually not? And so technology was a great place for me always to continue to know why. How computers work, how software works, how the system works, and finally how a team can work together and how people can be motivated and led in a way that came up with a product and a sustainable pace. Now, I'm saying all this and it sounded really great, but for the most part, and this was a phenomenal way for somebody to describe this to me. I was once told I was very good at managing down, but I was terrible at managing up. And it took until more recently to understand why this is. And the thing is that much of my personality wants to be nurturing. It wants to develop people, and it wants to foster interconnections. It doesn't really want to compete. And it's not that I had not recognized this in myself previously, but it did certainly explain that while I could put together a team and get the team interoperating well and doing something, when I would go to upper management, predominantly, white men who have been, how do I say this nicely? White men who have inherited enough money to make a software company. I think that's sufficient. It was sufficiently vague, right? Like I've probably alienated nobody else listening to this show, probably. So it's a very small piece of the sector of the population. So I had a hard time representing myself to them because they were alpha male type people. They wanted to compete and they wanted to win. And that was never what I did. How I got to where I am. Can I stop for a moment? Do you have any questions about my career?
Yeah, no, I think it's funny how you say, like how you were sharing how you think about the stereotypical engineer or, you know, the kind of nerd culture of quiet,
Right.
not the storyteller. You have this energy that, will come through in the audio. Like there won't be a video, but people will be able to like just hear and feel that it's like you want to be personable. Even just saying like, you were good at managing down, but not managing up. It makes sense when you think about like personality and personable. Um, so
Right.
where did your career then like take you?
By the time, I really enjoyed management.
Mhm.
And I'm surprised because I'm very much a technical person. I still wanted to know why. And so it was kind of odd that I enjoyed doing management. Well, one of the things, where it took me, it's interesting. One of the things that always sort of characterized my career is that I'm very, very willing to work myself to death. Yeah, I think I can just put a period at the end of that. I'm very good at when I believe something, I just absolutely live it. When I would get a job at a company, um, I would work honestly to death, and I've never had the best mental health. Um, I will say, I've struggled. I've struggled with ultimately what were identified as dissociative episodes, as well as delusions, and unfortunately, when I would try to go and get help for these, I remember there was a psychiatrist. He says, "Oh, why are you here?" And I said, "Well, here's what happens to me." And he said, "Well, wait a minute, hang on. You can hold down a job." I said, "Yes." He goes, "You have a long term relationship?" I said, "Yes." Because you finished like a graduate degree in chemistry. And I said, "Yeah." And he goes, "I don't really believe you can have these symptoms because you're just too highly functional." And I remember asking him, I said, "What do you think I'm doing then?" And he goes, "I don't know. That's why we should really probably schedule another appointment and probably long term." And I said, I'm not sure I need that. So, but I've struggled with mental health. And because I am capable of expressing like what happens to me, and I tend to be highly functional, I struggled getting care for it. Um, So when in 2005 it actually was. So I was 35 years old when this happened. Um, I so content warning here. There's some self harm. So skip forward 15 seconds if you want to. But I had carved myself up pretty badly with a butcher knife, and she was my fiance at the time. My wife now called the cops on me, and I went to the hospital for the first time. And they listen to me because apparently if you hurt yourself, they'll go, "Oh gosh, maybe she's serious, maybe these things really do happen," because she cut herself all up. So I started getting care then. But believe it or not, I prescriptions are not adequate ways of the managing mental health. I think I'm just going to leave it at that. I was going to say the problems I have, um but I've always struggled with this, and I have the tendency to work, 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 and then fall apart for a weekend so that I can come back in and work, 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 work. And it was winter solstice 2021. I was killing myself for this company, for these two white guys who inherited enough money to run their company to hire me. And I had a pretty severe breakdown. I'll just leave it at that. And my wife drove me to the hospital. This was for the fifth time. Um, and actually came home that day. So I thought of that as progress. Like that was good, right? But right then, the day after, I think she said, "Listen, you've done so much," because I started meditating. I started a spiritual practice. I started running. I started reading a lot more about what lies inside, trying to come up with a way of describing that. And I'm not doing a good job, but I started really looking more deeply into myself because I'd spent about 40 years trying hard not to. All the why was outside. But at 41 or whatever it was, I started to look at the why inside. And on December 22nd, I think it was, of 2021, my wife says, you have done so much work, but there is one thing I know you've never dealt with, which is gender identity. And I nixed it out of hand. I mean, I've known since I was about 4, maybe a little older, that someday I was going to transition gender. But I believed it was not for me. And this is one of the beliefs that I told myself, or one of the things that I told myself throughout my life. The good things are just not for me. I'm not supposed to have them. And there's childhood trauma behind that we don't have to talk about. But my wife said, go and think about this. And I knew it meant one thing, which was gender transition. And July 7th, 2022, I slapped on my first estrogen patch. And so now you see me today, not quite 2 years later, having completed a social gender transition, much of a medical gender transition, but also having this massive change in career as well. I can tell you about that, dude. Let me stop for a moment. I have this tendency to talk for like an hour and a half, and then I'm like,
that's okay.
Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think kind of what stood out to me to the most there right at the end was the fact that like your wife started the conversation, but it's something that you knew about, when you were younger. So was that something you ever had vocalized to your wife previously, or was she just really smart?
She is extremely smart. If you're listening, honey, you're very smart. She's always right. I mean, it may as well just, I was at an optometrist with our kid. I swear this will be a quick story. But we were talking about insurance. And I said, yeah, we have this kind of insurance. And then I pulled out a card that was different. And I went, I don't really know. I'm not the smart one. I think I said I'm the dumb one in the relationship. And my kid is sitting there. He's like slumped in his chair and he goes, yeah, that's for sure. And I was like, oh my God. Really? Thanks, kid. Anyway, all done with that. When I was very young, yes, I knew. So I grew up with 3 sisters, and my father was fairly absent. I worked nights or something. I got to tell you, my memory of that's a little bit fuzzy. But I think I got what I would consider as close to socialization as a girl as like any transgender woman would want. I grew up with makeup and Cosmopolitan and Vogue, and these were just the things I knew. And by the time puberty kicked in, I realized, yeah, okay, there's something different between me and my sisters. They develop differently, and I'm not. I don't know what's going on here, but I had heard there was a joke. I don't even know where it comes from, but I love the story. I had heard that there was this joke about a Swedish vacation. Does it ring any bells?
Mm-mm.
Okay. I don't know where it comes from. I don't know if Sweden had just approved some gender reassignment surgical techniques. Like, I'm not really sure what it was, but there was a joke about a guy who, presumably a transgender woman, who grew up in the United States, went to Sweden for a couple of weeks and came back a woman. So it was a Swedish vacation. And I remember being 12 years old going, oh gosh, is that all I have to do? Like, how much does a plane ticket to Sweden cost? Right? It can't be that much. But I knew I was going to transition. But because good things are not for me, and I'm working on this one, this is something that I'm trying to address. But because good things are not for me, I never put a lot of effort into the actual process. In 2001, to answer your question after 5 minutes, in 2001, I mean, I can still remember sitting down on the carpet, and I said to my wife, listen, I've looked into this process a little bit, and I'm going to transition gender. What do you think? because on our first date, by the way, I want to give a little bit of background. My first girlfriend broke up with me because I stretched out her dress. I'll put that in quotation fingers. Because maybe she stretched out her dress, right?
Mhm.
Who knows? But she broke up with me because I stretched out her dress. I had my first fiance uh, told me if I ever said anything, her father would kill me and then her. It was a bit of a deterrent. My first wife told me, yeah, this will never be an issue. And then it became an issue really quickly. So on my first date with this girl, I said, listen, this is the person I am. And she said, wow, really? Yeah, I'd love to see that someday. And I went, that's what they've said. It's not true. But in 2001, I said, I'm going to transition. I had looked into it. It was really difficult. I was even in California. I was in Los Angeles. But in 2001, the process was very difficult, exceptionally difficult. And so I didn't, plus there was a huge mental health barrier
Mm.
to surmount that I was pretty confident I wouldn't be able to get past. So it took until 2022 before I realized to myself, yeah, it is possible. As part of So in 2012, I had a very, very long psychotic episode. It was about a 6-week period where I was not very aware who I was, where I was, what I was doing. And at the end of it, I said, okay, this is where I'm going to fix everything. And I quit drinking. I started meditating. I started looking inside. I started a spiritual practice, started and taking better care of myself physically. But another thing that I committed to, because my son would have been a little more than a year old when I had this really long period of not really knowing where I was, I committed to myself. I said, you know what? I want to see my son grow up. I have to be there for him to grow up. And I have to be a good parent to him. And I'm not a good parent. What I am is a father. And fathers are men. And men don't do the types of things and think the types of things that I do. And so I have to crumple that all up into a wad of paper and throw it over my shoulder and let it go. Because that person doesn't exist. I'm actually getting a little bit broken up here. My apologies. But because I did that, I think I was capable of doing many other things in my life, but I certainly never solved my problems. Because I will say that starting July 7th, 2022, my life got just so much better. And I have a relationship, like a real relationship with my son, and a real relationship with my wife, and I feel emotions, and I feel physical pain, which, is a mixed bag. But I mean, there's a cliche in the transgender community that you went from living in black and white to living in technicolor. And I mean, cliches exist for a reason, and this is it's a perfect cliche. Within weeks, I mean, honestly, 2 weeks of putting on that first estrogen patch, I started experiencing emotions. It scared the hell out of me. I'm like, what are these things I'm feeling? I didn't realize the only thing I felt was anger for 52 years. So now I'm feeling, peace and joy and oh my gosh, what do I do with these things? And I said, I know what I'm going to do with these things. I'm going to quit my job and I'm going to write. Yeah. And I don't know exactly why I trusted myself or why my wife trusted me, but starting in November of 2022, I retired from software and now I write about the whole thing. We've been at this almost 25 minutes. I started in biology, in genetics, and so I thought about the transgender experience from a genetic standpoint. And then my background in analytical chemistry, it's data analysis techniques. I thought about the statistics of what it means to be transgender. And I'd been thinking about religious philosophy and psychology, and I put a lot of informal research into psychology and many other branches of philosophy and religious philosophy, political philosophy, and ultimately started melding all of these things together into what I realized was not the transgender experience, but just a normal human experience, why we are who we are. And so that's what drives me now. I know it took me 25 minutes. I could have started off by saying what I do is think about the normal human experience, but it takes 25 minutes to say what's normal, because everything is.
Yes.
Nothing is abnormal.
And hopefully someday you can get to the point where you realize that good things are meant for you. It seems like since July 7th, 2022, a lot more good things have come your way.
Yes.
So I think, in a journey of mental health, there is no 100% perfect. It's always going to be ebb and flow. But is your mental health, are you able to kind of manage mental health better now? Like you are now feeling emotions, which I think that would not help mental health. Kind of make it a little bit more challenging. So how is your mental health nowadays?
Gosh, that's an excellent question. When I first started writing, everything was amazing. So as November, December was amazing. From July, the first 6 months, amazing. Went into January of 23, things were pretty amazing. And then I started going, oh, gosh, not only can I feel joy, I also actually feel pain. And I'm trying to think of how I want to phrase this. I didn't know how to process it, especially in a healthy way. Yeah, that's fine. I'm going to let that go. I could probably revise it, but I didn't know how to process the pain that I was feeling. And so I started, this sort of a downward trend. Now, this actually correlated also with a change in my hormonal balance, because it's not really that important, but I had a bottle of estrogen that was that started to degrade, and so my estrogen levels plummeted, and that doesn't help. Maybe you've experienced hormonal changes in your life, and you get a little moody. I don't know if you've ever had that happen to you, but so your question was, can I manage my mental health better now? In February of 2024, yes. Toward the end of 2023, what I learned was that I had this big, thick layer of gender dysphoria, and I needed to peel that back before I could get to anything underneath. And what I learned underneath was 52 years of, I was going to say childhood trauma. I don't think I was a child for 52 years, but it was 52 years of trauma I was truly incapable of understanding, addressing, processing, working through. And so the end of 2023 was horrible, absolutely horrible. And this is, for what it's worth, it's a very common, I don't know how very common, but it is a relatively common transgender experience to have, we call it the pink haze. You go, oh, look, I've just transitioned. Now everything's got to be pink. My hair is pink, and now my lips are pink, and my eyeliner is pink, and I'm going to paint my teeth pink. I'm going to go get a pink dress so that I can get my pink car and drive to see Pink in concert. I ran out of pink things. Help me out.
I feel like you hit all the pink things. We are in the era of Barbie, so even more pink nowadays.
Right. It was a perfect time for Barbie to come out, as well as some other transgender women to come out. So in any event, you have this pink haze, and then you go, oh, well, I bought everything pink there is out there. And then you have to look inside and you go, oh, dang, I'm still the same person. And you are, you're the same person, just amplified. Now you can touch that. Now you can feel it. Now you can be that person, which is indescribable to finally to become the person you are. I'm struggling for words, which is stunning because I've written 100,000 of them in articles about this experience. But when I look somebody in the eye and tell them what I felt going through it, I don't know. It is ineffable. I love that word. And that's what it is. It is ineffable. So, but it also means that all of the rest of your life will hit you. And so you have to get through that dip of, okay, this is now my life. My life is now being able to process the good and the bad, and unfortunately, actually dealing with the bad and getting through it. So I believe now, it took about a year for me to get what I would consider stable, and it's still stable, for Amethysta, which might be a little early to tell, maybe, but I'm doing so much better. I've made a few videos, some on Instagram and some on TikTok, about the importance of gender affirming care. And I talk about just gender affirming care. I'm only talking about the transgender experience. But candidly, I don't want to, because I believe you need to be who you are too. And every listener who's out there has something deep inside. And they're thinking right now, gosh, I wish I could bring this out into the world, have the world see it, and have the world know who it is, and be that person, live that person. And that is our purpose as humans, to discover that and then ultimately to manifest it in the world. A little bit philosophical on you there for a moment, but that's kind of how I feel now. I feel better. It's very long-winded.
Well, it's a good thing to hear you are feeling better from some of those experiences you had a while back to now finding what your new balance is. And you've talked, the thousands of words you have written. What has this writing experience been like for you, and what is your hope for the future in writing?
Oh my gosh. There are many things that I've started, and maybe I've even finished some. I wanted to consider the scientific aspect originally of the transgender experience, and then just the human experience. I wanted to explore that originally. And then I started thinking about psychology, and that actually turned into evolutionary psychology. So how the transgender, and for that matter, the LGBTQ experience has really affected the evolution of the human race. Because if ever you wanted evidence against genetics being the origin of all of our behavior, like that there are still homosexual experiences. I don't know if that, there's really no better evidence. I'm not sure you could come up with better, because, there's no procreation, there's no progeny. But I think as a society that can accept that, has an evolutionary advantage, a reproductive advantage. So I went from science to psychology and to evolution, and now I think about identity from a very general standpoint. Where does our identity come from, and how do we fit into a social environment? I think that's really the biggest part, because identity is one part us and one part social environment, at least. Yeah, I don't know the exact I'm a chemist, and I'm like, I don't know. There's like carbon and hydrogen. Oh, the proportions? I don't know. It's like C84. I'm not sure. H something. I don't know the proportions. But we exist in a social environment. So how has this gone? It has gone through this a very large evolution, and it's changed what I wanted to do. Because as I started thinking about the human experience, I started wanting to, how do I want to put this? I started wanting to be a midwife of sorts. And so I started a Discord community, and then I started a website to which I accept contributions if you want to talk about identity. Um, I'm looking now. I started doing some public speaking, so now I'm going out and taking this message elsewhere. And here in 2024, the reason why you and I are talking is because I kind of went through an experimental phase. I said, looks like the message I've written is received and received better than I would have thought. Like who the hell wants to read science-y identity stuff? Apparently a lot of people. And so what I'm trying to do is now, start taking it to a grander level. I have this, I'm going to end up sounding ridiculous if I say it like this. I have this dream that, that at some point everybody in humanity recognizes the beauty inside them, and part of the beauty inside them is accepting the beauty inside everybody else. And I would like to form a foundation. I don't have a better word for it. I would like to have a foundation to which I can accept donations. And when people say, I need to experiment with my identity, I can say, done. Apply for a grant. Let's help you out on that. I've had people say, oh, so, helping the trans community. And I go, no, helping the human community. Because each of us goes through a process of identity, and each of us goes through a process of gender. Whether it's implicit or explicit, it doesn't make a difference. Each of us has to do that. And so, I use the term midwife. I mean, that's what I see. It's helping people birth themselves. That's where it's taken me.
And I think it's a good thing, to have that dream. It doesn't sound crazy to want a better society in ways for humanity. With all of this that you've shared, and your expertise in science and your passion now for gender and identity, have you thought about going back to school at all for further, more formalized educational training?
So the quick answer is yes. I've had two both of the psychologists I've worked with in the past about decade or so have said, you know what you need to do? You got to go and get, even if it's just a master's degree in social work or counseling. And I'll say what I did to because I had this conversation with one of my psychologists, one of the psychologists I worked with in the past decade or so. Because now he and I are friends. He retired, and you have to wait a couple of years, and then you can go out and have coffee. And so we do this, and it's really kind of fun. We actually had a great experience that we had that taught me a lot about myself, and it was interesting to be able to present it back to him and have him go, "Oh, dang, that's really profound." But he was telling me just the other, in January, he says, you need to go and get some formal training so that you can talk to people about this. And I said, the reason why I am not is that it's too small. I can't talk to one person. And I don't mean to diminish what psychologists do, because it's huge. You affect one person, it's not affecting one person. It's affecting that person and the person the people with whom that person comes into contact, that person's children and the children, the grandchildren. I mean, it's a cone of society, social influence from one person. So I don't mean to diminish what psychologists do. I have a grander plan. I don't know how else to put that. And the plan is to change the way society views our relationships with ourselves and with each other. And I could go, the stupid answer here is to say, well, I already have a PhD, right? Nobody asks. I've gone on, I've talked to people, not necessarily been on a lot of shows, but, I've talked to people and they go, oh, this is Dr. Amethysta Herrick. And people are just like, oh my gosh, you must know everything. And I go, well, not really. And they go, well, if you got a PhD, you must have a PhD in everything, right? Every PhD is a PhD in everything. And it's like, well, ironically, a PhD is like, a lot of knowledge about an extremely useless part of the universe. Like every PhD never ends up being something that's going to be broadly applicable. So anyway, that's the snarky answer to say, yes, I've considered the formal education. And not only is it just smaller than I'd like to focus on right now, I don't know that it would add. Maybe it would.
Hey, you got your PhD, so therefore you know everything. Why would you have to go back?
Right. On that note, to that point, I don't know. Give me a phrase. That is sort of this common conception, it's a common idea that you go and you get a bunch of education and you must be really bright. And I'll tell you the number one lesson I learned, because I always want to know why, right? So I'm thinking I'm going to school, I'm going to find out why. And the biggest lesson I learned in graduate school is that I'm never going to know why. Never, because there's just too much. And the funny thing is, to me anyway, to like a good scientist, like a sciencey scientist, I don't know how I want to put it, but to a scientist, like knowing that you will never know anything or know everything is exciting. Because there's always new stuff. You go, well, I learned as much as I could about this thing, but I don't know anything about over here. So I'm going to go and learn that. And then you go, and then there's something over there. And it never ends. And that's good. I was saying at the beginning of the show, that's what humans do. We change our physical environment, our social environment, or ourselves, and we overcome adversity. And much of that is learning who we are and how the universe works and how we fit into the universe. Everything else is kind of, frosting on top, the icing on top. So
yeah. So do you find that you're still, or will you always be overcoming some adversity?
I believe this is going to sound so pessimistic. I believe that is the human condition. And I will say that my own theory of both identity and gender is that these are processes. There's never a destination. It is, we have this origin of identity. And I know that there are people who will say, well, it's genetics. Some people will say, oh, it's your brain structure. It's your hormonal balance. It's a soul that some deity breathed into the clay. And to my mind, it doesn't make a difference. Because like the origin of identity, who cares? The point is that on the time scale of a human life, for the most part, these don't change really appreciably. And what we do as humans is we look at our origin of identity and we get a general idea of who we are, and then we can look at our social environment and there is negotiation that occurs. So I call it a mediation in some of the work that I've done, that the process of identity and the process of gender acts as mediators between the person we know we are and the person we feel safe manifesting in our social environment. And that process never ends because we're constantly changing. As I learn more about myself, and even this conversation here has given me more things to think about. And I'm going to write about it in my journal, and it's going to spark new thoughts. And that means I'm going to have to keep evaluating where I stand between my origin of identity and the social environment. So is that adversity? Maybe I could be more optimistic and say, no, it's not adversity, but we are certainly always, we have no choice but to continue evaluating ourselves against our social environment, because otherwise we stagnate. And stagnation as a human means death. You know, it is death. I mean, it doesn't take a lot of looking through history to see stagnation as death of a culture, can be death of a species, it can be death of a person. The processes are not remarkably different. That got a little dark. I apologize.
That's okay.
It's not all about death. It's also about great things. Find out who you are and find out you love to juggle broccoli.
Well, I appreciate, you sharing all of that, the thought process. It's interesting, to always hear how different people see life and, how they're experiencing it.
Yeah.
Now, before I start to wrap things up, is there anything else you would like to share with the listeners today?
I think we went over everything that I would have hoped to. If anybody is interested in learning more, I don't know if you would have links in the show notes, but you can get to my website at amethysta.io. And then the professional work that I'm doing now is all on a website called genderidentitytoday.com. I think that's about all that I would want to bring up.
Okay. Well, I will, of course, leave both of those links in the description so people can get in touch with you and your work. Now, at the end of all my episodes, I do ask my guests a random question. So my question for you today is, what celebrity wedding would you like to have been able to attend?
Oh my gosh. Joe DiMaggio and Marilyn Monroe. I can't believe I had an answer so readily available. But Joe DiMaggio was very mean to Marilyn, and Marilyn was a very fragile person. And for what it's worth, I have always really loved Marilyn Monroe and kind of, I don't want to say I identified with her. She was very easily underestimated. And after I've told you, I don't need any more education, I tend to be very easily underestimated. I mean, you're looking at me now, Sarah, and I mean, I've got, little purple curly hair with Betty Page bangs, and I'm sitting in my room with, some guitars and I don't have a presence of science. And I believe that's part of what made Marilyn not necessarily a presence of science, but she was underestimated, and that made her acting career so much more authentic. Because it had to be. She had to be who she was, or nobody, would have been interested in her. And I think it's the same with me, and that, I tend to get underestimated, and I have to be the person I am. To wrap that bit up, Joe DiMaggio was also really mean to Marilyn, and I would have loved to have shown up, just gone, "Hey, Marilyn, come on, let's go and get a drink instead." She would have missed her wedding or something, and Joe would have been mad, and she would have gone, "Ooh, God, you were meaner than I thought anyway. Never mind, we're not going to get married." And then maybe Marilyn would still be alive today.
All right, that brings this episode to a close. So as I just mentioned, I will be leaving both of those links for Amy in the description, whether you want to connect more on her personal life, more on her gender and identity work. Both of those links will be there. And of course, the podcast website will be in the description as well. That brings you to all of our past episodes, resources, social media, and our social media. We are on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn if you'd like to go support those pages by following them. If you'd like to support the podcast monetarily, there is a link to do that as well. That support is always appreciated. And if you would like to be a guest on the show and share more about your story, my email is in the description. That is always the best way to reach me. So thank you so much, Amy, for spending time with me today. And to my listeners for taking the time out of your day to hear a new story. Until next time, bye.
Bye.